I'd like to welcome you to the Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety May seminar. I'd like to go over a few of our housekeeping items. We can go back just one slide, please. As a reminder to everyone attending, this seminar is being recorded and all participants are muted. We're going to ask you to use the chat function to submit questions for the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. As we mentioned, there is Spanish interpretation available. In order to access it, please choose English or Spanish from the interpretation language selection option below, and that's the globe-like icon at the bottom of your screen. You can either select English or Spanish. We also have closed captioning available. To use it, please select the CC icon below and click Show Subtitle. Next slide. Welcome again, and if you haven't joined us, I want to introduce you to the Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety. Our mission here at UC Davis is to improve the health and safety of agricultural workers in the West through innovative research, interactive trainings, and tailored outreach. Today, we're really excited to hear from two researchers who are doing really important research on ag truckers with ag truckers and the potential policy implications of AB5, a policy that's potentially going to be enacted here in California and has implications for how the food that is grown in California and yet makes its way across the country, gets to all of our tables. And so next slide, please. I'd like to therefore introduce Dr. Steve Viscelli and Eric Balcom, who are going to talk about the potential shortage of agricultural truck drivers and the policy implications that potential legislation may have on the number of ag truckers and their health and safety and other workplace policies. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Heather. Looks like my screen share. Okay, there we go. Okay, so thank you, Heather. It's a real pleasure to be here, partly because we had this great partnership with the center to help get the driver survey portion of the study done. Everyone, I'm sure, has heard at least a little bit about the truck driver shortage in the United States. And this study was designed to look at the impact of that driver shortage on agriculture in California, obviously a subset of the larger labor market for truck drivers. So I'm going to start the presentation by framing up the issues around the idea of a shortage of workers in trucking more generally. And then we're going to zoom in with some of the results for the agricultural sector, in particular those that came from the driver survey that we did with Heather and the team. So there are really two different stories out there about this potential truck driver shortage that's out there. One of which, and it has been dominant until recently, is put forward often by the industry, and it's really one in which increased regulation of the industry and a lack of interest among young drivers has led to a shrinking of the pool of available drivers, and this is primarily through things like additional drug testing, additional regulations around drivers' work hours and electronic monitoring of those hours that have resulted in essentially a demographic problem for the industry, in which there are lots of older drivers being pushed out of the industry, and not enough young drivers or not enough young people interested in becoming drivers. And of course, when these policy questions of what we should do about this potential shortage get asked, the answer that we give to where this shortage is coming from is critical, right? So if it's a demographic problem where young people don't want to take the job, then maybe we should lower the age to get them before they take other occupations like plumbing and electrical, because you have to be 21 years old right now to drive interstate in the US. And so there's a very specific set of policy recommendations that follow from this explanation of where the driver shortage come from, which largely point to, promoting the job more, recruiting younger workers, and loosening regulations that may be restricting the supply of workers. The second story is really one in which the industry, takes a little bit more of the blame, and deregulation of the industry way back in 1980, which led to a really competitive market for trucking services, explains what has happened in the longer term. And that is really the advent of a lot of bad jobs, particularly in the entry-level segments where new drivers get their first jobs, and where there are very long work hours and very low pay for key segments of the labor force. And this narrative or explanation has really started to gain more currency, but just recently in the last couple of years. And so our study was really looking at kind of the total picture of of story one and story two's factors, and then applying it to agriculture itself. Okay, but this interest from California, of course, came in the last few years during COVID, and that is clearly, something that we have to understand the immediate impacts of. And so there are long-term trends that are affecting the availability of driver labor, and there were immediate effects of COVID, and we're all familiar with these to some extent, or in different areas of the economy and social life. For trucking, there were really profound shifts in demand. They actually started earlier for trucking with the decline in imports from Asia in particular, as you can see on the right there. And then, of course, a major contraction in certain kinds of goods being moved during the initial shutdowns. And then, as we all recall, I'm sure, a shift to home-based work and entertainment and food supplies that caused some imbalances on where goods were. And this clearly drove a huge amount of the chaos that emerged in the trucking sector itself, in terms of what kinds of goods trucks were hauling, what kind of trailers and supply facilities were being utilized at greater rates versus lesser rates. And just for an example, port truck drivers had virtually no work to do for a long time, while refrigerated drivers who were bringing food into distribution centers for grocery stores could work 24 hours a day. Okay, this immediate effect actually was made much worse once things picked back up, because the industry had gone through a major period of growth until 2018, in which freight rates that you see there up on the upper left there were actually quite high, and firms were adding more and more capacity. And then those freight rates began to decline after 2018. And so companies were actually already reducing their driver supply and their truck supply before the COVID shutdowns actually hit. And so we saw a reduction in employees and hiring, which kind of set us up for an even harder recovery, because the industry was essentially in a contraction phase before COVID. And so what this meant was that if you look at this graph in the upper left, I know it's a little complicated, so I'll walk you through it. But what you're looking at on the top there in the sort of dark green line are job openings. The purple are hires. The yellowish color is quits. And then the bottom line over here on the left, this sort of light green, is layoffs and discharges. So not surprisingly, we see this significant jump in layoffs. So during the contraction, right, this massive laying off, and then this slow rehiring afterwards as things build up. And so what we saw was essentially for the first 6 to 8 months was sort of rehiring the drivers who had been fired, right? But at the same time, we saw a significant rise in the number of quits. And this is some of the story that we've heard about, competition and from other jobs with good wages, right? And wages going up and, in retail and other jobs that would normally supply new workers or be an alternative to trucking. Those wages were going up, and trucking, where you have to stay out on the road oftentimes for weeks at a time, was not as attractive. And so as the economy restarted rapidly, as the number of available jobs increased dramatically and workers did not want them, we saw this big shortage. And that led to this historic spike you see down on the bottom right here in trucking rates. And if you look at that light green line on the trucking rates chart that goes all the way up to the right-hand corner, that's refrigerated trucking. So, these are, the folks who are going to be taking those fresh strawberries from the fields in California out across the country. And the rates to move that stuff doubled, and in some cases, even when we include rail, tripled in price. And so it was really this dramatic rise in transportation costs, which of course are going to affect the competitiveness of California's agricultural goods as it, competes with places like Florida that might be shipping strawberries west and California shipping them east. And so if you double that truck cost coming from California, it's going to affect the competitiveness of those products significantly. And so this was really what was driving the concern among California agricultural shippers, was this historic rise related to this shortage of available trucks. Okay, now the long-term issues that underlie this potentially, that are part of that story too, include some really important shifts in the norms, if you will, of that labor market. What kinds of workers are attracted to it? What do the jobs look like in terms of hours and pay, other benefits? Traditionally, trucking has been, at least prior to deregulation in 1980, was one of the best blue-collar jobs, very high salaries. In today's dollars, truck drivers used to average well over $100,000 a year in the 1970s. They had a very strong pension, health benefits, all those sorts of goodies that used to come with blue-collar jobs in the United States. And that all changed beginning in 1980. Now we have data from the state. This is some of it that we gathered going back to the mid-1990s. One of the big trends is that we've seen a significant increase in self-employment of independent contracting. This is affected by AB 5. And it has really transformed the way that workers work. In the case of trucking, what it means is that you end up paying for the truck that you drive. So you buy the truck, right? You might think of the port truck drivers that everyone there, I'm sure, is familiar with in California, who own the truck, pay for the fuel, pay for the insurance. And when we have the volatility, the normal volatility in trucking, those workers are the ones who end up really paying the cost of the fact that there might not be a lot of freight to haul that particular week or month. Now, what you're looking at here are wages. These go back a little bit further we were able to get them back to 1991. For general freight, which is essentially anything that can go in those standard box vans that you see, those dry vans, and then specialized freight. Now, refrigerated freight actually falls under specialized here, and that's in that sort of yellowish line. I should really get colors I can clearly identify for my slides. And again, what you see for the long-term trend, now, if we were able to go back to 1980, we'd see a real steep decline in wages as the industry is essentially deunionized, deregulated from 1980 to 1990. But then wages do continue to decline and stagnate for really until 2013, 2014, where we start to see this uptick in wages. And part of the answer to the shortage is that from story two, again, is that the industry has just failed to pay really good wages and has shifted a lot of risk and volatility to workers. And the wage data really supports this, that, when you raise wages, when you make the jobs attractive, you can actually increase employment in the industry significantly. So that's what we see here in the tail. I mentioned that the industry had gone through a significant period of growth with really high freight rates until 2018, and then began to contract in 2019. On the way to those really high rates and that good period, the industry was increasing wages to attract more workers as the amount of freight was moving grew, and they were able to attract more workers to the industry, which again, it puts a little bit of a dent in that story number one, that there's simply not enough workers out there interested in the job. Okay, and so now we're going to turn to that's sort of the bigger picture context and some of the macroeconomics and labor market economics behind this. But what we really wanted to do in this study was to talk to the drivers themselves, to understand the ways that they, experienced the jobs, the things they liked about it, the way that they were moving through their career, and some basic questions about whether or not you'd recommend it to other folks, or whether or not you thought it was a good job, and what the state could do to improve it, if anything. So now I'm going to turn it over to Eric, and he's going to cover some of the results from the driver survey.
Hey everyone, see me, hear me? So quick shout out and thanks to the Western Center. You really were able to mobilize your brains and your people to make this study really possible, especially in the field. That was really, really just crucial to our success. So thanks again for that. Yeah, so in discussing the truckers in California, we spoke to 3 distinct segments of truckers. Over the road truckers we encountered at the packing houses and coolers in the Central Valley and the Salinas Valleys. And Steve was able to get some port drivers on our online survey, and I was able to distribute cards for online services, online surveys to seasonal agricultural haulers in Northern California. Specifically, I targeted those who haul tomatoes in the Sac Valley area, specifically because I'd worked in that segment before. And so I kind of had some idea of where to find them, who to talk to, et cetera. What we found is unsurprising. Most truck drivers are guys. However, the highest representation of female drivers was in the seasonal tomato hauler group. And I can verify this anecdotally from my own experience. Overrepresented. It was cool to see. Average age was about 47 for the over the road folks. Ports was 41, seasonal was 34. This isn't that surprising. 47, however, is hardly a retirement age in the United States. So I don't see them getting aged out anytime soon, and we'll have more on that in a little bit. And seasonal drivers make sense that they're young. It's often a first landing spot for those who have just recently gotten their license, and many of the people who are getting the licenses are young folks. Huge representation of Hispanic, Latino, Chicano respondents, mostly the highest proportion, obviously, in the seasonal tomato hauler group. I met and worked with many. The radio, when I worked, was mostly in Spanish. Everyone spoke Spanish. Most people, and we were surprised to find this, were full-time employees of trucking companies. Given what we had thought and what we had learned, we believed we'd find more independent contractors, but we did find more employees. 29 were owner-operators, which means they have their own authority to haul their own goods anywhere in the US. And then 37 ended up being seasonal folks. Drivers working for small carriers were the greatest. Again, we were a bit surprised to find this, especially coming out of the coolers and packing houses, where we figured we would find more of the mega carriers, but we just didn't see that very often. Only a few of them reported for working for a carrier with over 500 trucks. This data shows the amount of people holding a Class A license in California. The total is about 500,000. You can see it broken down by age group and by men and women. The largest group, however, is the 50, 54, 55, 59 age group, and they are definitely leading the charge. But there's a significant amount in the younger age bracket too. We're still working to figure out exactly. There's some issues with data collection. Who has active medical cards, which would be demonstrative of people who can actually get in a truck tomorrow and drive. I, for instance, have my Class A license, but my medical card is not active. So I would need to go and get a physical in order to reactivate it so that I could drive a truck. So having that information would sort of be able to hone in on exactly who is behind the wheel or has been behind the wheel in the last couple of years. The job snapshot, I'm sure Steve covered this in those headlines, but we can go over it really quick. Most of the over-the-road drivers are gone for a few weeks and then they're home for a few days. This is the sort of the average we found. There's definitely outliers in either direction. Drivers work about 6 days per week. That's because they have a mandatory 34-hour reset after 60 hours of work. So they often take those breaks somewhere out on the road. And we have to sit around for 34 hours and rest up. Average wait time at customer locations was 3 hours. Again, huge outliers we found, up to 12 hours. But you can imagine waiting for 3 hours to pick up a load and then 3 hours to drop it off and how that cuts into your driving time. The median wage was about $1,200 per week. We're supposing that's about right. It seems this is all self-reported and we think we got those questions pretty clear. So it's not a bad job. It's obviously not as high paying as other jobs, and given the amount of hours and days per week that they're gone, it does reduce that number a bit in terms of an hourly wage. Most people we spoke to had no vacation, holidays, or benefit plans. Even when they were offered, they reported being expensive or just not wanting them. The days are long, 12 hours, 18 hours more. Steve and I can both verify that those days can be much, much longer, given waiting times and poor sleep and things like that. And as we can all imagine, living on the road, that gives you a few options for healthy options, whether it be for exercise, food, even rest. Sleeping in a truck is fine, but for long periods, it can be taxing on the nervous system. Port drivers work 5 to 6 days a week. That each day they're going to do 3 to 4 turns. That's picking up a container from the port, hauling it inland to an inland ramp, like a rail yard or a warehouse, and then they do that a few times. The median wage there was $1,400 a week, so slightly better given the amount of hours and days they work. 10 to 12-hour days, again, not much in the way of benefits. The seasonal ag folks work 6 to 7 days a week. I work 7 days a week. The days are 12 hours long. It's 2 shifts, night and days. It's a very physical job. You're in and out of the truck 10 times for 10 turns. So you're in and out of the truck 20 times, 30 times, 40 times, picking up, dropping off. Just every turn you're in and out, cranking up landing gear. So it's really physical. Almost no downtime during the day, except for your break. The work in tomato hauling, for instance, is 4 months, runs from about July to October. Again, no benefit plans, and the median pay was $1,500. It pays pretty well. You get paid more the more turns you make. What truckers thought, I was definitely surprised by, having worked as a truck driver. I had not the greatest impression of the industry. I've worked in various capacities over the years, but there is a lot of independence and flexibility. About half the people cited this as one of the main reasons they like the job. Travel was also cited by about 50%. For that reason, it's pretty great. Many people think the job pays well, and this is unsurprising given that many people come out of communities that don't have a lot of opportunities. Other people reported sense of accomplishment, camaraderie with other drivers, and satisfaction in being part of, trucking, as moving goods throughout the United States. If you bought it, a truck brought it, kind of thing. Obviously, the negative things we just talked about, I alluded to: long hours, away from home and family, concerns about safety, we'll get back to that, issues with traffic, we'll get back to that, and the physical demands for the job. This is especially true, whereas in seasonal ag, it is a physical job, but you do get to rest, you get to go home, you work and live in the same community. It's not true for over-the-road drivers. Is there a shortage? We asked the truckers. 73 said yes, 60 said no, and many other answers were given, rationales, explanations, ideas about what it could be. So when we asked about the job quality factors, the biggest thing, of course, was pay. This is unsurprising. And then the second thing was time at home, and other reasons were given. But pay and time at home are the things most drivers cite about the challenges of the job. And this is what they look for when they decide on a company, with 50% saying that pay is the #1 concern. And this contributes a bit, well, a lot actually, to the shortage/turnover phenomenon that we see, where truckers are continuously trying to find a better deal that pays them more for their efforts. This is just a brief map of we collected zip codes from our respondents. And so you can see there's a high concentration of California where we did most of our surveying. And given the amount of port and seasonal drivers, that really adds to that average. Everyone else predominantly comes from the Central East side of the United States, almost nobody in the Central West. And this leads me to our health questions that we had at the end of our survey. This is our first question. Well, the first question was, how tall are you without shoes on? But that was difficult for me to graph, so I left it out. But people are about average height, if you can believe that. But this scatter plot shows the range of ages and weights of drivers, and make of that what you will. And predominantly people who didn't have many health-related concerns related to the job, but a fair 40% did. And those concerns were high blood pressure, sitting for long periods of time, diabetes, weight, all the things you could ever imagine that come along with a largely sedentary job. And the people that did report concerns reported these issues. Safety concerns, mostly no. The highest percentage who were concerned were the over-the-road drivers. This data is unsurprising. Seasonal drivers and port drivers drive in the communities in which they live, in the areas, so they know the roads, they know the traffic, they know what to expect. However, over-the-road drivers are constantly in a new place, different times of day, different traffic conditions, all of the things you can imagine that would make driving feel like unsafe. Among those things, the biggest thing, predominantly, like overwhelmingly, were other drivers on the road. And this is both reflected in the answers of other truck drivers, who many senior drivers, experienced drivers, feel are not trained well and are dangerous, but also four-wheel car traffic. And this is unsurprising. Cars do cause many truck accidents, which is the other concern. Driving and accidents definitely related. The other smaller concern, but it came up several times, was robbery, which is an indication of the lack of safety at many parking areas, truck stops, side of the road, etc. Drivers indicated their concern with their safety while parked. And in terms of injuries on the job, most respondents reported no. This is a tricky question, I think, having worked in various industries. There's a culture of not reporting injuries, but nevertheless, people didn't feel like there were too many common injuries, the most common of which were small things, slips and falls out of the truck, pinches, hitting their head on things, back injuries from moving loads, things of that nature. And finally, the last question we asked was how people felt their health was, and 35% said good, and then 27 said very good. So overall, good and very good lead these scores. And we were surprised at times by people self-reporting of their indication of health. I would say myself, I would be good. I very rarely say I'm very good. So I'm happy to see that so many people responded very good and even excellent. And that's all I have.
Okay, thanks, Eric. And I am looking forward to hearing from those of you who study health and safety, what you think about those numbers. Eric and I, were surprised oftentimes to hear drivers that appeared to us to be, overweight or experiencing, not the best working conditions report excellent and very good health sometimes. But okay, so to bring it back to the issue of state policy and what we are learning about the things the state can do and should be thinking about relative to the issue of driver supply and the quality of the jobs and attracting a future workforce to them. As Eric's graph on the licensing shows, there are many people licensed to do this job, somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 or so. Prior to the pandemic, the industry estimated that California would need approximately 165,000 Class A drivers. And just in case we haven't covered that, Class A is the license you need to drive the biggest of trucks, tractor trailers over 26,000 pounds. And so we're showing, somewhere on the order of 3 times the number of folks who are licensed to operate the vehicle as are needed, according to the industry. And we don't know where these people are. And this gets to one of our good recommendations. We don't know whether they tried out trucking, whether they left, whether they're working in some other occupations that require a Class A CDL. There are some major ones like driving buses and construction equipment, but those numbers just don't add up to this large of a population licensed to move or to operate the vehicles. So we'll get back into those data needs, but this is definitely an area where it's clearly not that we're not licensing enough people or that enough people aren't getting the training. Lots and lots of people are getting have received the training and are licensed to do the jobs. The training numbers, we don't have data that far back from the state, but the state is spending an increasing amount of money training truck drivers. This again gets to the data needs. We don't know what's happening to these drivers once they get the training. So these are Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act grants. So these are federal grants administered by the state. And this gives you a sense of how many, millions of dollars, roughly 18 million or so in 2021 that are spent to, help people get training, which can be great, but we don't know, what the return the state is getting for it or those workers are getting for their investment. Like, are they, for instance, we don't know if these folks are still working as truck drivers a year after they finish their training, or 2 years or 5 years, let alone how good that those jobs are that they're in. So I'm sorry. So these are basically categories of major policy that we're thinking about. So licensing being number 1, workforce development and training being number 2, and then basic labor regulation being number 3. And so here the big news has been around Assembly Bill 5, which is an independent contractor related law that says essentially if you're a trucking company and you have a truck driver that works for you, they're your employee. They cannot be classified as an independent contractor and self-employed unless they have their own motor carrier authority, they work for other trucking companies, they meet a number of criteria. And so this has been a major concern to the industry and is really lots of lobbying, lots of industry complaints around this, and it deeply affected this study. Eric and I spent many months working with the leading industry lobbying groups and associations, the California Trucking Association and the Harbor Trucking Association, to develop a carrier survey to be a complement to the driver survey. Worked with them to, change questions they didn't like or they thought might be problematic, really went out of our way to come up with a survey that would work for them. And in the end, they decided, because of AB5, we believe, that they didn't want to participate at all. Now, AB5, the conclusion, our preliminary conclusion, is that AB5 is actually not going to affect agriculture much. Which is great news for the ag industry. Part of the reason is that, as Eric suggested earlier, we didn't see nearly as many contractors as we expected. We saw far more employees and true small business owners and owner-operators who were out there moving these agricultural goods. Many of those who were going out of state were actually, will not be affected by this law. So what we have seen from AB5, it hasn't actually gone into effect. It was passed and was supposed to go into effect at the beginning, January 1st, 2020. So what you see up there is new motor carrier authorities. So this is essentially a measure of small business formation in trucking. California led the nation by percent of all new authorities, which is punching above its weight a little bit, because California is a major trucking state, but not quite 14.4% of employment. It tends to be several percentage points below that, but produced about 14.4% of all new small trucking companies. Once AB5 was enjoined by a federal injunction preventing it from going into effect, that rate declined slightly to 12.2%, which is still not bad. And then once AB5 went into effect July 1st, the percent of new authorities jumped up. What this is basically telling us is that these truck drivers who were independent contractors are likely to be forming their own small businesses in response to the law. And that's what you see in the graph here, another indication of this. So this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what it's showing is the blue are the self-employed truck drivers who are unincorporated. They don't have their own company. They haven't formed an LLC or an S Corp or anything like that, versus those who are self-employed and incorporated. And so we see a major jump there. Those are likely those small, companies being formed, incorporating, getting their own operating authority, and starting to work independently as a result of AB5, which is essentially saying no more independent contractors. You're either a trucking company or an employee. Okay, so the big takeaways so far for us, story one's facts, right? That we have this demographic problem, that we are losing drivers to regulation, does seem to have some truth to it. But story two really seems to explain those facts better, ultimately explain them better. We are losing potential drivers and productivity to regulation, but the industry overall has developed this lean labor market approach, which, right sizes to demand, and then is, because of the way workers have been, treated and laid off and, been recruited into the occupation and maybe not earned great wages, and then let go. It's very hard to rehire those people. It's very hard to ramp up the number of truck drivers quickly to meet demand, as we needed to do after COVID. And so firms really are struggling to adjust to these rapid changes in demand. And there really are these bad practices out there, failure to pay minimum wage, misclassification, that are resulting in these high levels of turnovers that may be creating a long-term supply problem. So, and this is where we're still digging around those CDL licenses, and the state really needs to do more, is, if we do have 500,000 people who are licensed to do this job, but only 165,000 of them are needed, right? That tells us something really important about, the way that this labor market works. And we can think about the costs incurred by those workers who went out, maybe quit another job, spent some, significant amount of time training, maybe paying for some of that training to get that job in trucking, and then found it to be, not up to what their expectations were that led them to it, right? That is a major problem. And over time, that's going to deplete the potential supply of workers out there. And there is strong evidence to suggest that that is a big part of what's happening. However, those are big picture things. Ag is a specific segment, and it has some advantages and disadvantages. The long haul work is clearly, it has to happen fast. The stuff's often moving very far, which means lots of, time away from home. And it has to be live loaded most of the time, meaning you've got to wait there while the truck is filled up. So that tends to result in some unpaid hours. It's a big negative. But there are lots of local jobs. There are lots of field jobs, and there are jobs in the ports, which can be improved in quality. And as Eric suggested, are also excellent entry-level jobs. And so there's some potential synergy there between maybe supporting training programs and leading directly to good jobs where people can stay at home with the proper state policy supports. Can also lead to some internal labor markets and some job progressions. We met some folks who started out as field workers and became immigrant field workers, oftentimes undocumented, who became truck drivers, and one, in fact, who started his own trucking company and now employed 3 or 4 other drivers. And it started out, harvesting crops. And so there is a labor market there that can, provide some additional mobility for workers who, can end up making, $60,000, $70,000 a year. And seasonality, again, is a big factor here with ag, but it has both positives and negatives. It allows you to do maybe some temporary starter jobs, but it is not going to provide necessarily that consistent employment year round. Okay, so the kinds of recommendations, and I'll wrap up on this, that we're thinking about right now are certainly better data to track what's happening with this licensing and what the DMV, which is collecting lots of data, could do to sort of track people better. Of course, promotion of jobs to new worker pools, including especially women, and then tracking some of these training funds and just saying, hey, if your organization is training workers using these funds, we want to know 2 years down the road, are these people still working in the job that we paid to have them trained in? And, what are they earning, for instance? More accurate information to drivers, potential drivers, seems to be a big one. There's a lot of, misinformation, almost a gauntlet of information that workers have to navigate to get into these jobs, which leads many of them to end up in bad jobs. And I think that's probably the number one issue here, is that we have a pipeline that is often pulling in increasingly vulnerable workers, particularly workers of color and immigrants, into the worst jobs. And so we really need to think about how these state policy supports, again, licensing, training funds, maybe accreditation, which is required now for training programs, can be both upgraded, but also lead directly into better jobs rather than into the worst jobs. Typically, drivers are ending up in these over-the-road jobs where they're earning poor wages and working lots and lots of hours, very high turnover. So overall, the training grants are not being used effectively, and they're not, these aren't great opportunities for these workers. So there's really, I think, a potential synergy there among all of these different supports and policies that the state has relative to increasing the sort of the usefulness quality of that pipeline into good jobs with benefits both for the labor market overall, but also those training programs. Now, the state is already doing a lot, so especially AB5. So I do think there's kind of a wait and see recommendation that we're going to end up with that says, like, let's, hold the course for at least a little while and see what happens with AB5. Right now, it does not seem to be we're not seeing any shortage of trucks. We're not seeing any spike in prices. no, problem created by it that's, justifies the kind of hair on fire response that the industry has. We just don't see that, and we definitely don't see that kind of threat to agriculture at this point. But it does also raise the issue of engaging better with the industry. I mean, we learned this. There was a lot of distrust from the industry in engaging with this project. We drew two conclusions from that. One is that we, need to do a better job of collaborating with the state, policymakers do anyway. But two, that the industry should not be treated as a monolith. The folks who are really concerned about AB5 represent a small portion of the industry. There are many good employers out there. There are, with every given issue, there are going to be a certain group of trucking companies, truckers themselves, who are more or less concerned. And so the idea that you just go to the one association of trucking companies, the California Trucking Association or the Harbor Trucking Association, and let them determine, or their board of directors determine, whether or not you participate in a survey or advocate for one law or another, may not be the best approach for the state, where they want to, have a more nuanced approach to the industry and engage with the folks who want to work with them on particular issues, whether it's clean, truck programs, operational approach, changes to operational approaches, or the general rules that govern trucking work. So that leads to some follow-on suggestions about, looking into some of the interesting alternatives that we saw. This was very interesting, came out of the talking to drivers. There were ways to deal with those long wait times. For instance, some drivers were given local jobs to just assemble the loads that the long haul drivers would then take out. So we met a driver from Georgia who I interviewed, who was sent to California, and he'd work in California for a week or two at a time, and he would do the local driving and waiting and picking up all the loads for his coworkers, who would then pick up the trailer and drive it to Georgia, and then bring carpet. Actually, they brought carpet back, and then agricultural goods east. And then, so there are operational changes that the state could potentially incentivize with different policy changes. And then finally, the state's doing a lot of other stuff in trucking, including a future ban on diesel trucks that just passed, billions of dollars of investment in low emission vehicles, and considering some legislation currently to ban self-driving trucks and other things around new technology. All of that should be taken into account as the state thinks about its future labor policy for the ag workers who actually move the state's products out and around the country. Okay, and with that, I'll wrap up, and we'll take any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you so much, Steve and Eric. We did receive a question, and then I have a few of my own. So everyone, feel free to add questions to the chat. So there was one we received, had to do with reports of predatory practices by trucking schools regarding fees and equipment rentals. How much of an impact does this have on new workers coming into the industry and staying?
I think it has a huge impact, and I do think it's one of the things that, again, with the direct funding of some of these schools via state programs, that the state should really have a better handle on. So there are a number of different kinds of schools. Some are run by the trucking carriers themselves, or the companies. Some are a for-profit. You probably see them around your community. It says, come here, learn to drive a truck. ACE trucking, truck driving school. And then some are community college programs that are non-for-profit, tend to be a little bit better. And then there's sort of an old school model of apprenticeships, in which you have a partnership maybe between a public community college or a community organization and an employer or set of employers who say, not only will we pay for the training of that driver, but we will employ that driver. We'll pay them while they train, and we'll give them first employment. And this is actually President Biden is a big fan of apprenticeship programs. You may have heard that. And so at the federal level, the Department of Labor, Department of Veterans Affairs are partnering to create truck driving apprenticeships. Now we're exploring some areas where the state can participate in those, and trying to, and I think ag could be one. There's a bit of an issue where we need some scale in the partners, and some good big employers like Walmart and some others, which is actually an excellent. People are sometimes surprised to learn this. It's an excellent employer for truck drivers. And has, they start their drivers over $100,000 a year, and pay for the training, et cetera. So there are some really important basic things we need to do there of kind of creating those categories, figuring out how different recipients of training grants fit in there. And then what metrics we want to use to assess their, how well they do. The other big issue there is what training contracts. So a lot of times drivers will be overcharged for training. They might pay $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, for training that should probably cost closer to $2,000 or $3,000. Oftentimes they'll be offered kind of free training, and they'll say, the company will say, you don't have to pay for anything, but you have to commit to working for us for a year. And then they're paid below market wages for a year, far in excess of what the training would have actually cost. And they kind of get this captured, labor as a result. I personally and others, have argued this is essentially indentured servitude. And that, it is illegal. I think in the United States, we've brought some lawsuits to argue this, that, not only that, but there's sort of no poach agreements. So if you're a trucking company that wants to hire away that worker, the company with the contract will sue you and say you can't hire this worker, again, limiting that voluntary labor market. That's sort of the foundation of worker rights in capitalism, is that you can go work for whoever you want. And so we do have a lot of work to do there on the training side.
Got it. Thank you so much. One thing from being out in the field, it was great for our team to go out. I just want to say, Eric, thank you for acknowledging the work of our team. And we really enjoyed it also. I think it was a great opportunity for all of us, especially coming out of COVID. It was fun to be out in the field, interacting with workers. And one thing that I noticed, and I think we talked about, was some of the changes in process that a lot of the trucking, the ag processing plants had to put in place to interact with truckers after COVID. And I'm just that as a small example, sort of how they checked in with the processing plant to register their truck being there and register the ability to pick up their load. And so I guess my question is, have there been, across the industries, we're seeing changes in the way work is done after COVID? What changes has the trucking industry or ag trucking experienced post-COVID that have been maybe for the better or for efficiency's sake, or maybe not for the better, but what changes have happened to ag trucking after COVID?
Do you have want to comment, Eric, or should I start?
You go ahead on that one.
Okay. So unfortunately, I think we've seen some interesting possibilities, but the challenge is that the market just fell apart. And so by the time we were out in the field, we didn't hear a lot about the shortage, right? Because the crisis was starting to abate. And trucking had added capacity because of those great rates. And so there wasn't a lot of pressure to do some of the things that, were possible to improve things, because they didn't have to. And the big example, and I'm glad you raised it, the check-in. So these truck drivers oftentimes have to drive to some place and go check in with a piece of paper, and then they tell them, oh yeah, that load will be, that hasn't even been picked yet. Like go park over there and we'll call you when it's picked. And so one of the systems that we saw there in Bakersfield when we were surveying on carrots was drivers would call in remotely and they could check in online and know when they should show up, which means, and this gets into the weeds a little bit, but for a truck driver, if you're at the truck stop and you haven't started your workday, your hours haven't started that you're restricted to working. And so you can hang out there, you can do your laundry, you can, not start the truck, inspect the truck, start your workday because oh, they're not ready for me. I've got 5 more hours. And so those sorts of basic, use information to make the system run better. Usually drivers don't have any power to do anything to, about that. And shippers don't have any real reason to help the truckers out because they're just going to park there. And most times they would rather have you parked like right over there where they can yell at you and be like, hey, wake up, come and get your load, rather than having to call you and then you say, oh yeah, I'll be there in 20 minutes. They want you there when they're ready for you. And so unfortunately that power dynamic has gotten worse because now there are too many drivers and too many trucks. And so the rates have fallen through the floor and, the independents and others are really sort of, it's harder and harder on them.
Got it. Interesting. Okay. Last question I'll pose to both of you, because Eric, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this also, which is going back to the survey, and I guess I'm biased towards the survey because we got to be part of it. But what findings from the survey did both of you find most interesting? I think that when we were out there, I felt like there were lots of moments of, oh man, that's surprising. Another person with this kind of a reaction or perspective. And so, taken as a collective of responses, what did you all find most interesting or surprising?
A few different things I found interesting. I'm going to touch on the things that apparently one of my slides disappeared, but this brings us to this point. Fundamentally, the questions on the survey were about recruitment and retention. And so like the distillation question for recruitment is, would you recommend this job to a friend or a loved one? And overwhelmingly people said yes. And I was totally taken aback because I wouldn't, but overwhelmingly, I mean, like 90% of people said that they would, which was phenomenal. And the second question, which pertains to retention, was, are you planning on quitting? And overwhelmingly, again, 90% of people said no, not until retirement. And I wish that we had that information going into it, because I think we would have gotten some more traction from the trade organizations, because I think that they really felt that we were out to get them, and that the information that we got from the truck drivers was going to bury the industry, and cause some huge rupture. But it just wasn't. It, like, absolutely was not. Most people seemed, well, disgruntled for very good reasons, like most workers are. They weren't leaving. They were just going to continue. They liked more about the job than they didn't like. And some of it, I think, is the opportunities from where many people were coming from were less good than driving a truck. But be that as may, people were going to stay. And then, I think, I don't remember the percentages now, but the other question that was important was, do you think that drivers should be paid for waiting time? Do you think that they should be paid for all the time they're at work, not just when they're driving? And overwhelmingly, people responded that they wanted overtime, which is great to hear. We're all on the same page. And that, but not overwhelmingly did they respond to the question about, should truckers get paid for all the waiting time? And the responses on that were an interesting sort of mix, but predominantly about, well, if I get paid for this time I'm sitting here, like, that means like my employer is going to make less money, or they may not make enough money for me to remain employed, which we know is not true at all. And fundamentally, like Steve was saying about, back to the technology question, I truly believe that the technology exists in the world, in the ether, to streamline and optimize appointment times and things like that for truck drivers, where they can literally just show up with the load ready and take off again, which would increase the amount of time they're on the road, which is the amount of time they're getting paid. But as we know, like the shippers they don't have to. It's more work for them. It would cost them more money to adopt these sort of optimization processes. And why would they? They literally just don't have to. So I think there's room there for, if shippers were forced to optimize because it cost them money, things would move along much more quickly.
And I will be very brief because Eric really took I'm going to echo his what he found most surprising. I thought the how happy many of the drivers were with their work, and the quality of the jobs were the big surprises, the big important surprises to me. I think part of the explanation is that we did not find the patterns of employment that we expected. So these were not, again, many more full-time employees, many smaller companies that were built with, handshakes and family values and just small operations where people, just treated each other well, 4, 5, 10 truck operations that were based on like, I'm going to keep you working for me because I'm going to treat you well. And in the end, that's going to save me money as an employer because I'm not out trying to, hire somebody every 6 months. And you're going to work hard for me and, be a good employee. And so there was a lot more feel good stuff than we tend to encounter with a lot of the big mega carriers that are servicing, the Fortune 500 companies and the, moving stuff for Amazon and Walmart and others in between, long distances. So that was the big surprise. I do want to say what, echo Eric again on the thank you to the center. Like I said, the start is incredible collaboration, and it absolutely would not have been possible for us to survey the drivers without the center's help, without Heather, Rebecca, and the whole team, helping out, pitching in with ideas, resources, expertise. We never would have been able to complete the driver surveys. So thank you.
Oh, absolutely. We enjoyed it thoroughly and feel like it was really important work and a segment of the agricultural and workforce that we don't encounter it as often, and yet it's so critical, the transportation of food. And Eric, you had a quote, if it gets to your table, it was trucked there, whatever it was fabulous. So I want to write that down, because the truckers who bring everything from our food to anything else we buy is, without them, we wouldn't eat, we wouldn't do anything. And so just like the farm workers, the farmers, the growers, the ag employers, the ag truckers are essential. And so thank you for the opportunity to understand their lived experiences a little bit more. This research is essential. And so we're thankful to see the results from it, because rarely does one get to participate both in the data collection and then also get to hear the results as they are being analyzed. So thank you all for joining us today. This was a great presentation, and we look forward to being able to share findings. Hopefully, as the reports and papers are written, we will disseminate them via our newsletter and our website. And we hope to see everybody for the June seminar coming up in just a month. And have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Take care. Bye.